I never believed in ghosts until I accepted food from a stranger during Hungry Ghost Month in Singapore. My name is Joshua, and what happened to me in that cramped studio apartment still makes me check over my shoulder whenever I walk alone at night. I was 24, fresh from Beijing, and completely unprepared for life in a city where ancient traditions blended seamlessly with modern skyscrapers. The job opportunity had been too good to pass up, but nothing could have prepared me for the cultural shock of navigating Singapore as a mainland Chinese who knew nothing about the local customs. The company had set me up in a budget rental in Toa Payoh, an older residential area filled with towering HDB flats and narrow streets that seemed to whisper stories from decades past. Everything felt foreign to me. The humid air that clung to my skin, the mix of languages I heard on every corner, the way people moved with an urgency I hadn't experienced back home. I was struggling to adapt, working long hours and coming home exhausted to an apartment that never quite felt like mine. What struck me most during those first few weeks was how isolated I felt despite being surrounded by millions of people. I would walk home from the office each night, passing neighbors who smiled politely but never stopped to chat. The elderly aunties who ran the coffee shops would serve me with efficiency but little warmth. I was just another foreign worker trying to make it in their city, and I understood that. But the loneliness was crushing in ways I hadn't anticipated. During my third week in Singapore, I started noticing changes in the neighborhood. Small altars appeared outside apartment buildings, decorated with burning incense sticks and flickering red candles. Plates of food were carefully arranged on these makeshift shrines, everything from whole roasted chickens to bowls of rice and fruit. The smoke from the incense created an almost mystical atmosphere as it drifted through the corridors and stairwells of the housing blocks. I asked my colleague about it during lunch one day, trying to sound casual despite my curiosity. He explained it was Hungry Ghost Month, a time when the spirits of the deceased were believed to roam the earth, searching for food and comfort from the living. Families would make offerings to appease these wandering souls and ensure they didn't bring misfortune to their homes. He spoke about it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, but something in his tone suggested I should take it seriously. The concept seemed fascinating, but distant to me. Growing up in modern China, I had been raised with little exposure to such traditional beliefs. My parents were practical people who focused on education and career advancement rather than spiritual matters. Ghost stories were entertainment, not reality. So when I walked through the neighborhood each evening, I observed these rituals with the detached curiosity of an outsider looking in. The offerings became more elaborate as the month progressed. Entire meals were laid out on tables positioned strategically along walkways and void decks, paper money burned in metal containers, sending ash floating through the air like gray snow. The elderly residents moved through these preparations with practiced precision, their faces serious and respectful as they arranged each element of their offerings. What I didn't understand then was that these weren't just decorations or cultural displays, they were boundaries. Sacred spaces created to contain and direct spiritual energy that locals believed was very real and very dangerous. The food wasn't just symbolic, it was sustenance for entities that existed in the spaces between our world and whatever came after. Every carefully placed bowl and burning stick served a purpose I was too ignorant to recognize. That night, I decided to take a different route home from work, curious to see more of these spiritual preparations that seemed to consume the entire neighborhood. The streets were quieter than usual, with most families gathered indoors for evening meals or temple visits. I found myself walking down a narrow residential road I had never explored before, lined with older shop houses that cast long shadows under the dim street lamps. The offerings here were different from what I had seen in my own building, more personal, more intimate. Small clay pots filled with rice sat beside burning joss sticks, their smoke creating ethereal patterns in the still evening air. Red candles flickered in glass holders, casting dancing shadows on the weathered walls. The entire street felt like a shrine, transformed into something sacred and otherworldly. I was examining a particularly elaborate setup when I heard soft footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw an elderly woman approaching slowly along the sidewalk. She was tiny, barely reaching my shoulder, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a simple floral blouse that looked like it belonged to another era. In her weathered hands, she carried a metal food container, the kind I had seen other residents using for temple offerings. Her face was kind but deeply lined, with eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world gently, each step measured and purposeful. There was something almost luminous about her presence in the flickering candlelight, as if she belonged to the spiritual atmosphere that surrounded us. As she drew closer, she smiled at me with genuine warmth. It was the first truly welcoming expression I had received from a local resident since arriving in Singapore. Her voice was soft and melodic when she spoke, carrying the gentle cadence I had begun to associate with the older generation here. "Eat. You must be hungry," she said, extending the container toward me with both hands in a gesture of respect and offering. I was touched by her kindness in that moment of loneliness. Without thinking, I accepted the container and thanked her warmly. The metal felt surprisingly cold against my palms despite the humid evening air. When I turned to ask her name just seconds later, the street was empty. She had vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving only the lingering scent of jasmine and something else I couldn't identify. That night, everything changed. My apartment felt different the moment I stepped inside, as if the air itself had thickened. Cold drafts swept through rooms where all the windows remained sealed shut. In the kitchen, I heard the distinct sound of chopsticks clinking against porcelain. But when I investigated, nothing was there except the food container I had left on the counter, now mysteriously opened with half its contents missing. The disturbances escalated over the following days. Shadows flickered in my peripheral vision, darting away whenever I turned to look directly. I would come home to find plates neatly arranged on my dining table, filled with food I had never prepared. The smell of burning incense would drift through my apartment at random hours, even though I owned no joss sticks or candles. At night, when I switched off the lights, a faint whisper would echo through the darkness. "Thank you," it would say, so softly I almost convinced myself it was just the wind through the building's corridors, but the voice was distinctly feminine, carrying the same gentle cadence as the elderly woman who had offered me food. The haunting reached its peak when I woke from a nightmare that felt more real than any dream should. In it, the old woman sat at my dining table, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as she forced down bite after bite of food, her jaw unhinged like a snake's, tearing at the corners as she consumed everything in sight with desperate hunger. I jolted awake, heart pounding, but the smell of incense filled my bedroom and I could see bowls of food arranged perfectly on the table that had been empty when I went to sleep. The final confrontation came when I returned home late one evening after working overtime. As I opened my apartment door, the thick smell of burnt offerings hit me like a wall. Sitting at my dining table was the old woman, pale and translucent now, her eyes hollow black voids. She chewed endlessly on invisible food, her movements mechanical and unsettling. When she noticed me, she looked up with those empty sockets and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You invited me," she said, and I realized the horrible truth of what I had done. I fled that apartment that very night, leaving everything behind except the clothes on my back. The company helped me find new housing, and I never returned to collect my belongings. But sometimes I wonder about the next tenant who moved into that studio unit, and whether they found a metal food container waiting on the kitchen counter, neatly placed, as if nothing had ever left. Now I understand why my colleague spoke about Hungry Ghost Month with such seriousness. Some traditions exist for reasons that go far beyond superstition, and some hungers can never truly be satisfied.